Veteran saw a young mom selling her father's flag for food. What he did next shocked the whole town. In a small Kansas town, on a bitter winter morning, a young mother walked into a pawn shop carrying the only thing she had left of her father, his folded American flag. She wasn't proud of what she was about to do, but her little boy was hungry, and the cupboards were empty. What she didn't know was that someone was watching, an old veteran standing quietly in line behind her, a man who had once fought beside the name engraved on that brass plate. That moment, that single act of desperation, would awaken a promise made decades earlier and spark a movement that reminded an entire town what honor truly means. A bitter Kansas wind swept across Main Street, rattling the loose tin signs and scattering dry snow over cracked pavement. Inside Bill's Trade and Loan, the air was thick with the smell of oil, dust, and old metal. Emily Carter pushed open the door, a folded American flag pressed to her chest. The small bell above her rang sharply, echoing through the quiet shop. Every sound in the room seemed to hold its breath as she stepped inside. Her boots left melting footprints across the linoleum floor. The shelves around her were lined with worn-out tools, hunting rifles and radios that hadn't played in years. A fluorescent light flickered above, bathing everything in a tired yellow glow. Emily hesitated at the counter, clutching the flag tighter. The cloth felt heavier than it ever had before, heavier than hunger, heavier than shame. Bill Jenkins, the pawn shop owner, looked up from his ledger. His eyes softened when he saw what she carried. In this small town, he knew nearly everyone, and he remembered the funeral, the folded flag, the little girl holding her mother's hand. "Emily," he said carefully, "you sure you want to do that?" His voice trembled slightly, the way people speak when they know they're witnessing something sacred. Emily's lips trembled. "How much for this?" she asked, barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air, fragile as frost. Bill blinked slowly, glancing at the brass plate on the wooden frame. Staff Sergeant Thomas Carter. He exhaled, rubbing his temples, searching for an answer that didn't exist. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks, carrying the distant hum of church bells. In the corner of the store, an old man leaned against a display of power tools, his breath visible in the cold. He wore a flannel jacket and a veteran's cap faded with time. His weathered hands tightened around the handle of a wooden cane. The name Carter struck something deep inside him, a memory half buried but never forgotten. Emily's fingers brushed over the cloth one last time. "It's just fabric," she said softly, as though saying it might make it true. Her voice cracked, betraying the lie. Bill shifted uncomfortably, his pen still in hand. "Emily, that flag ain't worth what it cost to earn," he said gently. "Some things don't belong behind glass," but her eyes stayed fixed on the counter, hollow and determined. Through the frosted window, a small boy pressed his palms to the glass. Luke's breath made foggy circles as he waited, his thin coat no match for the cold. Emily saw him and swallowed hard. She wasn't selling the flag because she wanted to. She was doing it because her son hadn't eaten properly in 2 days. Her pride was the last thing she could afford. The heater sputtered, filling the silence with a low hum. Bill looked from the flag to the young mother's face, then back again. "Emily, I can't put a price on it," he muttered, shaking his head. But she stood still, staring at the counter, her knuckles pale from gripping the edge. "Please," she whispered, "just something to get us through." The old man in the corner Walter Reed didn't move, but his chest rose and fell with quiet struggle. The name on that brass plate echoed in his mind like a drumbeat. Thomas Carter. The man who once pulled him from fire, the man whose sacrifice had haunted his every sunrise since. He closed his eyes, feeling the past crawl up from the dust. As Bill hesitated and Emily waited, Walter's decision formed quietly inside him like a prayer. Some debts, he thought, were written not on paper but on the hearts of those who remembered. Outside, the snow began to fall heavier, blanketing the town in white. Inside the pawn shop, 3 lives hung in silence, bound by duty, desperation, and a flag that refused to lose its meaning. Emily Carter lived in a world measured by bills, tips, and hours on her feet. The small diner on Main Street was her second home. The clatter of dishes, the hiss of the coffee pot, the endless sound of country radio in the background. She wore a tired smile for strangers and a brave one for her son. But when the door closed at night, the weight of everything she carried came crashing back. The apartment above the laundromat smelled faintly of detergent and cold air. Luke's laughter was the only thing that filled the silence between the hum of the old radiator. The cupboards were nearly empty. Half a loaf of bread, a few cans of beans, and a box of cereal she rationed for him. Emily would skip dinner, pretending she'd already eaten at work. Her hunger was quiet, like everything else in her life. On the night before she went to the pawn shop, she sat at the small kitchen table, staring at the folded flag on the counter. It rested there like an accusation, reminding her of everything she'd lost and everything she couldn't keep. She whispered, "I'm sorry, Daddy," and brushed her fingers across the cloth. The stars under her touch felt colder than the room around her. Her father, Staff Sergeant Tom Carter, had been the town's pride, the kind of man who fixed everyone's fences before fixing his own. The day they buried him, the mayor gave a speech about honor and sacrifice. Then the flags came down, the reporters left, and life moved on, except for Emily. For her, the war never ended. It just changed battlefields. At 29, she had learned to survive by routine. Wake Luke, pack his lunch, clock in, serve coffee, smile, repeat. Each day bled into the next until they all looked the same, except for the nights she cried quietly after tucking him in. She'd tell herself, "You're doing fine, Em," even when the power bill said otherwise. Strength, she had decided, was just the absence of choice. The people in town meant well. They'd drop off casseroles, mention church fundraisers, and whisper about how that poor girl never got over it. Emily learned to thank them, then lock her door and face her reality alone. Charity made her feel small, like a reflection of pity rather than pride. The flag was her last piece of dignity, and soon even that would be gone. That week, the temperature dropped below freezing. The pipes groaned. The landlord stopped answering calls. Luke came home from school with flushed cheeks and asked for soup. Emily stared at the pantry shelves, then at her purse. Her paycheck was gone. Rent, utilities, groceries already spent. Something had to give. Late that night, she folded the flag with trembling hands. She wrapped it in a worn pillowcase, the same one she'd used as a child when she was scared of thunderstorms. She kissed Luke's forehead as he slept and whispered, "Mommy's gonna fix everything." Her voice cracked on the word everything. The next morning the car heater blew cold air as she drove toward town. Frost clung to the windshield. and the radio played softly, a country song about home and heartbreak. She turned it off halfway, letting the silence fill the car. Every mile closer to the pawn shop felt like betrayal. Every heartbeat whispered her father's name. As she parked outside Bill's Trade and Loan, Emily sat for a long moment, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She could see the reflection of the folded flag in the rearview mirror. "It's just cloth," she said again, trying to believe it. But deep down she knew better. That flag wasn't just her father's memory. It was her last piece of hope. And she was about to give it away. Walter Reed stood near the back of Bill's Trade and Loan, his posture stiff but dignified. His flannel jacket carried the scent of smoke and machine oil, reminders of mornings spent fixing engines in his barn. The cane he leaned on had seen better years, much like him. His breath formed faint clouds in the cold air as he watched the young woman at the counter. He didn't know her, but something about the way she clutched that flag felt familiar. He had come for tools, a small repair for a life that had long since stopped needing much fixing. But when the brass plate on that flag caught the light, the world seemed to narrow. Staff Sergeant Thomas Carter. The name slammed into him like a bullet he never saw coming. His grip on the cane tightened, his heart beat heavy in his ears. Time folded back 20 years in an instant. In his mind he was no longer an old man in Kansas, but a young soldier under a burning foreign sun. The sound of gunfire, the smell of sand, the screams over the radio, they all came rushing back. He saw Tom Carter again, calm under chaos, brave when fear was all around. The man who had dragged him to safety when the convoy was ambushed. The man who never made it home. Walter's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, to say something, but his voice was buried beneath years of silence. He watched Emily place the flag on the counter with trembling hands. "How much will you give me for it?" she whispered. Walter's chest ached. He had seen men trade their honor for money before, but never out of hunger, never like this. Bill Jenkins looked torn, rubbing the back of his neck as if searching for a polite way to refuse. The heater rattled, filling the pause with a mechanical hum. Emily stood still, her face pale with embarrassment. Walter could see that she wasn't careless, just desperate. He could feel the sting of pride and pain wrestling inside her, the same way it once had inside him after the war. He glanced toward the window and saw the boy, Luke, small and shivering, pressing his palms against the glass. The image pierced through him. A son waiting for his mother, the same way his own boy once had before the accident that took him. Walter looked back at Emily, her shoulders tense under a worn coat that barely kept out the cold. He thought of his own wife, gone now 5 winters. Of the house that echoed with quiet, the porch that faced an empty field. He'd spent years pretending solitude was peace. But watching Emily now, he realized it was just surrender. And something inside him, something good that he thought had died, stirred back to life. The room felt smaller as the snow thickened outside. Walter took a deep breath, tasting dust and regret. "You can't just stand here," he told himself. "Not again, not this time." His heart pounded hard enough to drown out reason. Every part of him wanted to step forward, to keep that flag from being lost to another man's shelf. But he hesitated, the fear of intrusion holding him back. He was a stranger, after all. Maybe she'd see him as another old fool sticking his nose where it didn't belong. Still, his conscience screamed louder than his doubt. He remembered Tom's last words. "Promise me you'll look after her if I don't make it." Maybe fate was finally collecting that debt. As Emily reached for the cash, Walter made his choice. He gripped the cane tighter, his steps slow but certain. The bell above the door jingled again as the wind howled outside, and for the first time in years Walter Reed felt the pull of duty rise inside him. The war wasn't over after all. It had simply followed him home. "Ma'am, you can't sell that." Walter's voice cut through the quiet like a crack in the ice. Emily froze, startled, her hand hovering over the counter. The sound of those words carried authority, the kind that came from a life of orders, battles, and promises kept. Bill looked up, sensing the shift in the room. The air turned heavy, and even the heater seemed to go silent. Emily turned toward him, her face flushed from embarrassment. "It's mine," she said, her chin lifting in defiance. "I can do what I want with it." Her voice shook, but her eyes didn't. Walter met her gaze, a mix of strength and pain he hadn't seen since the war. She wasn't just selling a flag. She was fighting for survival, and he couldn't let her lose that battle. He took a slow step forward, the wood floor creaking beneath his boots. His old joints protested, but his conviction didn't. "That flag," he said quietly, "wasn't made to be sold." The words hung between them, filled with something deeper than judgment, sorrow, respect, memory. Emily's grip tightened around the folded cloth, as though shielding it from him. Bill shifted behind the counter, unsure whether to intervene. "Walt, maybe let her," he began, but Walter raised a hand, eyes still on Emily. "I ain't here to lecture," he said softly. "I'm here to help." He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his wallet, the same one he'd carried since 1972. From it, he took a few folded bills, weathered and soft at the edges. "Then let me buy your groceries," he said simply. "Keep your father's flag." His tone wasn't pleading or proud. It was final, steady as a man who'd already decided. Emily's jaw tightened. She shook her head. "I don't take charity." Pride was her last armor, and she wore it even when it cut deep. But when she looked through the window and saw Luke's small frame in the cold, her voice faltered. Walter followed her gaze, and something in him broke. The sight of that boy, waiting, hungry, innocent, was too much. "It ain't charity," he said, his voice rough but kind. "It's what your daddy would have done for me." Confusion flickered in her eyes, but before she could speak, he placed the money gently on the counter and stepped back. Emily's hands trembled. Her heart pounded so loud she could hear it. Everything inside her wanted to refuse, to protect the last shred of dignity she had left. But the warmth in that man's voice disarmed her. Slowly, hesitantly, she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered, the words tasting strange, half relief, half shame. Walter tipped his cap. "Ma'am," he said softly, then turned toward the door. The bell jingled as he stepped into the snow, the wind carrying his figure away down the street. Inside, Emily stood frozen, staring at the money he'd left behind. She didn't understand who he was, or why his words had left her heart aching, like an old wound reopened. Bill cleared his throat gently, eyes misty behind his glasses. "You did the right thing, hon," he said, but Emily barely heard him. She gathered the flag in her arms and held it close, her tears falling silently onto the glass case. Somewhere deep inside, a part of her that had been numb for years, began to stir again. Outside, Walter walked slowly through the drifting snow, his breath shallow, his chest heavy. He didn't know what would come next, only that something had shifted. For the first time in decades, he'd felt his purpose return. The cold Kansas wind bit at his face, but he welcomed it. Redemption, he thought, always starts with a single step toward someone who still believes. The Kansas sky had already gone gray when Emily stepped out of the pawn shop. Snow drifted down in soft, steady flakes, settling on the hood of her car. The cold bit through her coat as she clutched the flag to her chest, its edges brushing against her chin. Luke sat inside, fogging up the window with his breath, his small face pressed to the glass. Emily smiled weakly, but it didn't reach her eyes. She started the engine. The heater coughed out a breath of stale air that barely warmed her hands. The radio flickered to life, an old country song about coming home, about love that never fades. She switched it off halfway through. Silence filled the car, broken only by the creak of the windshield wipers and the faint hum of tires rolling over snow. The flag rested on the passenger seat, wrapped in its worn pillowcase. It felt heavier than before, as though the stranger's voice still lingered in its folds. "It's what your daddy would have done for me." The words echoed in her mind like a whisper she couldn't silence. She didn't understand why they hurt so much, or why they made her feel less alone. Streetlights glowed weakly through the snow as she drove past familiar places, the diner where she worked, the church she rarely had time to visit, the memorial park where her father's name was carved in bronze. Everything looked small and quiet, like a town holding its breath. Emily's reflection in the windshield looked older than 29. At a red light, she stopped and turned to look at the flag. Her fingers brushed over it gently. "Daddy," she whispered, "I'm trying." Her voice cracked in the stillness. The light turned green, but she didn't move. The flag wasn't just a symbol anymore. It was a promise she kept breaking every time life pushed her down. Luke stirred in the back seat. "Mom?" he said softly. "Are we gonna be okay?" The question struck like a blade made of innocence. Emily blinked hard, forcing a smile into her voice. "Yeah, baby," she said. "We're gonna be okay." She didn't know if it was true, but sometimes a mother's faith had to come before fact. The snow deepened as they reached the edge of town. Fields stretched wide and empty, dotted with the skeletons of barns long abandoned. The headlights carved a lonely path through the white. Emily felt the ache of everything she'd lost, her father, her peace, her pride, and yet, somewhere inside, a strange warmth flickered like a distant star. She thought about the man in the shop, the way he'd looked at her, not with pity, but with something older and steadier. Respect. Gratitude. It had been years since anyone looked at her that way. The thought brought tears to her eyes. She wiped them away quickly, not wanting Luke to see. As they pulled into the small gravel driveway of their apartment building, the world felt painfully quiet. The snow had muffled everything, even the hum of the car. Emily turned off the ignition and sat still, her hand resting on the folded flag. "It's just cloth," she whispered again, but the words broke before they reached her lips. When she finally stepped out, the cold wrapped around her like punishment. She held the flag close, carrying it upstairs as though it were alive. In the dim light of their living room, she laid it on the table and stared for a long time. She didn't know it yet, but that night, that choice had already set something in motion she could never undo. Back at his farmhouse on the outskirts of town, Walter Reed sat alone at the kitchen table. The clock ticked loudly against the silence, each second reminding him that time had become both his companion and his enemy. A heater rattled in the corner, and the smell of old coffee filled the room. Snow pressed against the windows, making the world outside vanish into white. On the wall above him hung a dozen photographs, black and white faces in uniform, dusty frames lined in neat precision. Every one of them was a memory he couldn't escape. His eyes always landed on the same one, Tom Carter, 24, smiling under a desert sun. Walter traced the edges of the picture with his finger, the way someone might touch a wound they've learned to live with. He opened a shoebox on the table labeled Charlie Company. Inside were relics of another life, a rusted dog tag, a compass with a cracked glass face, and a folded letter brown with time. Walter unfolded it carefully, reading words he'd memorized decades ago. "We fight for each other. Walt. If I don't make it home, tell my little girl I kept my promise." His throat closed around the words. He leaned back, eyes fixed on the ceiling. For years he'd prayed for a sign that he could make peace with his past. Maybe today had been that sign. Seeing Emily, Tom's girl, standing there ready to sell the very flag they draped over her father's coffin, it was like fate had dragged him back into service one last time. The guilt that had followed him since Afghanistan surged again, heavy and familiar. He had lived while better men had not. He'd come home to silence, to a world that didn't need soldiers anymore. His wife had done her best to understand, but some wars never end. They just change their scenery. And when she died, the house became as hollow as his chest. Walter poured himself a cup of coffee, hands trembling slightly. The cup clinked against the saucer as he set it down. He looked toward the empty chair across from him and imagined Tom sitting there, laughing like he used to. "You'd call me a fool, wouldn't you?" Walter muttered with a small smile. Still chasing ghosts. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the cracks in the old barn. Walter rose slowly, his knees stiff, and walked toward the back room where an old chest sat beneath a flag folded just like Emily's. He opened it, revealing a collection of medals and a journal. On its first page, written in faded ink, were the words, "For those we couldn't save." He sat down beside the chest, the weight of memory pressing on his shoulders. The images came back in flashes, smoke, dust, the sound of a heartbeat in his ears. He remembered Tom's hand gripping his arm, the heat of fire, the blinding white as the explosion took him. Walter pressed his palms against his eyes, whispering, "I'm sorry, brother. I'm so damned sorry." When he lifted his head, tears had streaked down his weathered face. He took a deep breath, exhaling years of silence. On the table behind him, the letter lay open beside his old service cap. For the first time, Walter felt something shift inside. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the beginning of it. The kind that comes from finally doing what's right. He folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the box, and looked toward the window where snow kept falling. Somewhere in that same storm, Emily was sitting in her little apartment, clutching her father's flag. Walter closed his eyes and whispered into the quiet, "I found her, Tom. I found your girl," and for the first time in years he slept without nightmares. The morning sun rose weakly over Kansas, painting the snowbanks in shades of pale gold. The diner at the corner of Main Street flickered to life. The smell of bacon, the clang of plates, and the low hum of conversation. Walter Reed pushed open the door, greeted by the jingle of the bell and a wave of warmth. He didn't come here often anymore, but something had drawn him in that day. He took his usual seat by the window, the one overlooking the memorial wall across the street. The waitress behind the counter turned Emily Carter. She froze for half a second, her hand tightening on the coffee pot. Walter gave a polite nod, unsure if she remembered him from the pawn shop. Her eyes widened slightly, then softened with quiet recognition. "Morning," she said, her voice careful, almost shy. Walter smiled faintly. "Morning, ma'am." Their exchange was brief, but something unspoken passed between them, a thread of shared understanding, stitched by fate. Emily poured his coffee, her hand steady though her heart raced. She hadn't expected to see him again, yet somehow it didn't feel like coincidence. The diner buzzed around them, farmers swapping weather stories, the radio murmuring old country songs. But for Walter and Emily the world had gone still. He stirred his coffee without drinking it, eyes fixed on the rising steam. She moved between tables, but her mind stayed near him, circling the question she hadn't dared to ask. "Who are you, really?" When she returned with his breakfast, Walter left a folded note beneath the saucer. "The world still remembers your father," it read, written in firm, deliberate handwriting. Beneath it, a small amount of cash, far more than the meal cost. Emily found it after he'd left, her fingers trembling as she unfolded the paper. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She sat down in the empty booth, staring out the window at the white horizon. The flag had been back on her shelf since that night, untouched but no longer buried. Now, reading those words, she felt something shift inside her, pride, grief, gratitude, all tangled together. For the first time in years, she whispered her father's name out loud. "Tom Carter," she said softly, as if testing the sound. The name felt strong again, no longer heavy with shame. Customers came and went, unaware that something sacred had happened in that small diner. Emily wiped her tears quickly and tucked the note into her apron pocket, her heart beating fast with questions. That evening, after closing, she walked home through the snow with the note clutched in her hand. The words replayed in her head with every step. "The world still remembers your father." Who else remembered? Who was this man who spoke with such certainty, who looked at her like he'd known her forever? She reached her apartment, placed the note beside the flag, and stared at them both. They felt connected somehow, pieces of the same story she hadn't yet heard. Luke peeked out from his room, rubbing his eyes. "You okay, Mom?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Yeah, sweetheart. Just thinking about Grandpa." That night, as the snow fell silently outside, Emily lay awake listening to the wind. For the first time, her thoughts didn't spiral into fear or regret. Instead, they rested on the image of an old man with kind eyes and a voice full of memory. She didn't know it yet, but that morning in the diner had changed everything. The next morning, Walter returned to the diner, carrying a worn envelope tucked neatly into his coat. The paper was yellowed with age, the edges soft from years of handling. He'd read it hundreds of times, but never aloud. It was time, he'd decided, for those words to go where they were meant to, back to Tom Carter's family. Emily was behind the counter, refilling sugar jars and humming quietly to herself. When she looked up and saw him, her heart skipped a beat. She wiped her hands on her apron and approached, unsure whether to speak first. Walter smiled gently and held out the envelope. "Your father wrote this," he said. "I think it's time you had it." Her hands trembled as she took it. The handwriting was unmistakable, bold, neat, disciplined. Where did you get this?" she asked. Walter hesitated, his eyes distant. "He gave it to me before his last mission," he said softly. "Told me to deliver it if he didn't make it home. I didn't have the heart to face you back then." Emily sat down at the nearest booth, her knees weak. She unfolded the letter carefully, afraid it might crumble in her hands. Walter stood nearby, hat in hand, watching silently. The diner noise faded. No clatter, no voices, just the sound of her breathing as she began to read her father's words. "My dearest Emily, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it back. But don't let that make you sad. I left this world doing what I believed in, protecting men who would have done the same for me." Her voice faltered. Tears blurred the ink as she continued. "Promise me you'll never forget what this flag means. It's not just mine. It's ours." By the time she reached the end, her tears were falling freely. The letter spoke of love, faith, and the small town values her father had lived by. It was like hearing his voice again after all these years. Emily pressed the paper to her heart, unable to speak. Walter's eyes glistened as he looked away, giving her the privacy she needed. When she finally found her voice, it came out broken but steady. You knew him?" she asked. Walter nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am. We served together overseas. Your daddy saved my life. I owe him more than I could ever repay." The truth hit Emily like sunlight breaking through clouds, sudden, blinding, and beautiful. The diner door opened and closed as customers came and went, but Emily and Walter stayed in their own quiet world. She wanted to ask 100 questions, but only one mattered. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Walter's gaze dropped to the floor. "Guilt," he said simply. "Sometimes living feels harder than dying when you're carrying someone else's miracle." Emily reached across the table, placing her hand gently over his. "He'd be glad you did this," she said, her voice trembling. "He'd be proud you came." Walter nodded, his throat too tight to answer. The letter between them felt like a bridge built across years of silence and sorrow. As he rose to leave, Emily stood too, clutching the letter to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. Walter tipped his hat. "Don't thank me, ma'am," he said softly. "Just keep his light burning." When the door closed behind him, she sat back down, reading the letter again. Each word breathed life back into her father's memory and into her own. They met again the next afternoon at the corner booth, coffee steaming between them. The diner's windows fogged as snow sifted down outside in quiet sheets. Walter set his hat on the seat and folded his hands, steadying his breath. Emily waited, letter in her purse, courage in her eyes, questions on her tongue. The bell over the door jingled, and the world narrowed to their table. Walter began slowly, choosing words like a man disarming a memory. "Afghanistan," he said, eyes distant, "a road that ate convoys whole." He spoke of heat that bent the horizon and radios that crackled bad news. He told her about a squad that learned to smell danger in the wind, and a young sergeant named Tom Carter who steadied every heart. He described the ambush without theatrics, only truth and reverence. The flash, the dust, the ringing that turned the world to a bell. Tom moving through chaos with a calm that felt impossible. Hands dragging Walter from shrapnel and smoke, quiet as prayer. "Your daddy shielded us," Walter said. "He chose us over himself." Emily listened with both hands clasped, knuckles white with love. Each detail rebuilt the man she'd known only in folded silence. She pictured boots in sand, a flag on a sleeve, a grin that hid fear. Her breath trembled, but she held Walter's gaze and didn't look away. Grief softened, reshaped by honor into something she could carry. "People like to call it heroism," Walter murmured, voice low. "But Tom would have called it Tuesday, just doing the right thing." He smiled faintly, a weathered line breaking across his face. Brave never bragged. Brave just showed up and stayed. Emily nodded, tears shining like winter light on glass. "Thank you," she said, the words tender, reverent, real. Walter lifted a palm as if to block praise from hitting him. "No, ma'am," he answered, soft as a benediction. "I owe him everything that came after that day." Silence wrapped their table like a quilt sewn from faith. They talked of small-town things because small things matter. How wheat turns gold when the wind remembers its lines. How church bells mark time even for those who've stopped counting. How Main Street keeps its porch flags even in hard winters. How legacy is a harvest planted by hands no longer here. The waitress refilled their coffee and pretended not to stare. A couple of farmers swapped weather and hopes by the door. Somewhere a child laughed at a whipped cream mustache. Life moved around them like a river curving past a stone. Two souls sat firm, letting the current carve a gentler shape. When the check came, Walter slid it closer and left more than enough. Emily tried to argue, then chose a quieter victory. She accepted. "Come by again," she said, voice steady, invitation simple. He nodded, eyes bright with the relief of being useful again. The bell jingled and let a sliver of winter in as he left. That night, Emily set the letter beside the folded flag. Between them, a space no longer felt like absence. It felt like room for a bridge patiently being built. She touched the glass of the frame and whispered, "Dad." Across town, Walter whispered, "Brother," and meant both words. The diner's parking lot was a quiet map of tire tracks and vows. Walter sat in his old pickup, engine ticking like a pocket watch. Snow blurred the streetlights into soft halos of intention. He pulled a pen from the visor and a napkin from the dash. "Some ideas arrive as orders you're grateful to follow." He printed the words slowly, careful as a rifleman at dusk. "Carter Scholarship Fund for Children of Fallen Soldiers." He underlined Carter once, then twice, and swallowed hard. A plan gathered itself like a flag catching a steady wind. Debt at last had found the shape of repayment. He thought of kids whose cupboards sounded like Emily's, of report cards folded into pockets with quiet pride, of winter coats borrowed from cousins who'd outgrown hope, of school fields where names are called and futures listen. He pictured Tom nodding, "Make it about the next in line." The next stop was the farmhouse that no longer felt like home. Walls that had heard too many apologies and not enough songs. Photographs of a life that had learned to live in black and white. He opened the safe, hands steady, jaw set like a pledge. Numbers turned. A door in his life clicked open. There were papers, deeds, bonds, a lifetime's careful harvest. He sifted the stack, weighing cost against meaning. The farm had given him years, but asked for nothing grand. Now it could give someone else a first day that felt possible. He placed the deeds aside with a nod that ended a season. Walter called the bank manager he'd known since Carter High. "Need to sell," he said, simple as a farmer reading rain. On hold, he watched flurries drift like ash that meant warmth. He saw Emily at a podium he'd built with his own hands. "Seed money," he whispered. "Tom deserves a harvest." He drove to the Veterans Hall and tried the side door. It opened with a groan that sounded like memory waking. The room smelled of lemon oil, flags, and dusted stories. On the corkboard, names, years, a calendar of honor. He pinned the napkin there, small as a spark in tinder. Back in the truck, his breath fogged the rear-view mirror. He wrote figures on the napkin's edge, math of mercy. Tuition, books, boots that fit, meals that don't skip. Numbers turned into faces, faces turned into futures. He smiled, lines of age softened by lines of purpose. The sky cleared, stars pricking holes in the cold. He imagined a Memorial Day with more names called forward. Not from stone, but from a stage where hope shakes hands. He could hear a crowd stand the way a nation stands. Hand over heart, not for him, but for what outlives him. Before turning the key, he bowed his head and prayed. "Lord, take what's left of me and make it seed." The engine rumbled like a hymn finding its tune. He drove toward tomorrow, napkin, plan, riding shotgun. And somewhere in the dark, legacy reached for a light switch. The Veterans Hall smelled of old wood polish and stories that refused to fade. Rows of folding chairs lined the room beneath banners of red, white, and blue. Walter Reed stood at the front, one hand steadying himself on the podium. Beside him, Emily Carter held her father's flag pressed close to her heart. The murmurs of the small Kansas town quieted as he cleared his throat. He began without pretense, his voice carrying the steady rhythm of service. "Most of you knew Tom Carter," he said, eyes scanning familiar faces. "He was a good man, the kind who didn't fight for medals, but for the man next to him." Heads nodded slowly, farmers, veterans, widows, each recognizing that kind of love. Walter's voice softened. "And he saved my life. That's a debt you don't forget." The hall grew still, even the heater seeming to pause to listen. Walter told the story plainly, without glory or grandstanding. He spoke of a roadside ambush, of a moment when courage outweighed fear. When he finished, there was a silence thicker than any applause. He looked down at the folded flag and said, "This isn't about me. It's about keeping promises." Emily stepped forward, her fingers trembling around the flag's edges. Her voice broke once, then steadied with something stronger than pride. "My father believed America was more than a place," she said. "It was people, people who look out for each other when no one else will." She looked up, meeting the eyes of the same townsfolk who once pitied her. "I thought I'd lost everything," she continued, voice clear now. "But I learned that legacy isn't what we inherit. It's what we build together." She lifted the flag high, its fabric catching the yellow light. "This isn't a symbol of loss anymore. It's a reminder that we're never alone." The crowd exhaled as though the whole town had been holding its breath. Walter stepped beside her, one hand on the podium, the other steady on his cane. "I'm starting a fund," he announced, "in the name of Staff Sergeant Thomas Carter." He turned slightly. looking at Emily. For the children of those who gave their all. A murmur rippled through the room, surprise, then admiration. The weight of what he'd said began to settle like snow on warm ground. A local mechanic stood first, pulling a folded bill from his wallet. "Tom fixed my truck after the tornado," he said, voice rough with memory. "I reckon this is my turn." He placed the bill on the table at the front. Then a retired teacher followed, then a farmer, then another. One by one they gave what they could, nickels, checks, promises, prayers. The sound of hands clapping rose slowly, hesitant at first, then sure. For a moment the town forgot its divisions, its politics, its pride. It remembered instead what community felt like before cynicism. Emily's tears came freely now, not of sorrow, but of relief. Her father's name would live again, not in marble, but in motion. Walter looked at the growing pile of donations and smiled faintly. "This," he said softly to Emily, "is what healing looks like." She reached out, placing her hand over his. "You did this," she whispered. He shook his head. "No, ma'am." He did. The crowd stood together, united by one man's legacy and another's gratitude. When the meeting ended, the flag was raised on the wall behind them, not as decoration, but as declaration that sacrifice never expires. Outside, the cold wind cut through the trees, but no one hurried away. They lingered, talking softly, smiling wider, walking slower. Something sacred had been restored in that small Kansas town. Winter began to thaw, but Walter's strength did not return with the sun. He'd been coughing for weeks, though he'd brushed it off as age. Emily visited often, bringing soup, reading letters, tending his garden. She'd started filing papers for the scholarship fund, her father's name in print again. Walter called her "kiddo," the way Tom once had. One afternoon she found him sitting by the window, sunlight spilling across his hands. "Paperwork's almost done," she said, setting a folder on the table. He smiled faintly. "Good. I want it finished before spring." His voice had grown thinner, quieter, like a flag frayed at the edges. Emily's heart sank, though she forced a hopeful grin. Luke came by after school, carrying drawings of soldiers and stars. Walter laughed, his chest wheezing, but his eyes bright. "Looks just like your granddad," he said, pointing at one sketch. Luke puffed his chest proudly. "Mom says he was a hero." Walter nodded, whispering, "He sure was, son." "Still is." The house smelled of coffee and medicine, a mix of life and decline. The clock ticked slower now, each sound heavier than before. Emily caught him staring at the flag folded on his lap. "I think he'd be proud of you," she said softly. Walter smiled faintly. "I just paid a debt long overdue." A week later, the call came while Emily was closing the diner. Walter had collapsed while mowing the yard, the doctor said. She raced to the hospital, her apron still dusted with flour. When she reached his bedside, he was pale but peaceful. Machines hummed quietly, a rhythm that life fights to keep. Emily took his hand, her tears falling freely. "You rest now," she whispered. "We'll carry it from here." He blinked weakly, lips parting to speak one final truth. "Then my debt's finally paid," he murmured, voice fading. The line on the monitor steadied, a final salute. The funeral was small, just as he'd wanted. Old soldiers stood at attention, their eyes wet but proud. The pastor spoke briefly of service, of redemption, of reunion. Emily placed the folded flag he'd loved on his chest. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." A week later, she received a sealed envelope in the mail. Inside was a deed, Walter's farm, signed over to the foundation. A letter came with it, written in the same careful hand. "For the Carter Fund. Don't waste a single acre of faith." She pressed the paper to her lips, sobbing softly into gratitude. On Memorial Day, Emily stood at the town square beneath a new banner, "Carter Scholarship Fund in honor of the fallen." She spoke briefly, voice steady but eyes shining. "This was born from a promise between two soldiers," she said, "and carried forward by a town that remembered what honor means." The crowd applauded as she raised the flag above the foundation's door. Wind caught the fabric, unfurling stars against the Kansas blue. Emily looked up, sunlight warming her face through tears. She could almost hear their voices, her father's and Walter's, in the breeze. Debt repaid, it seemed to say, and legacy restored. Summer came early to Kansas that year, carrying the scent of wheat and new beginnings. The sign above the renovated brick building read Carter Scholarship Foundation. Inside, framed photographs lined the walls. Tom Carter in uniform, Walter Reed smiling beside him. A flag stood proudly in the corner, its fabric perfectly folded, its meaning perfectly alive. Emily Carter unlocked the door each morning with purpose, not survival. The first scholarship award had drawn families from all across the county. Children in pressed shirts, parents holding worn hands, veterans sitting in the back with pride. The hall buzzed with gratitude, the kind that can't be rehearsed. Emily stood at the podium, the same one Walter had built before he passed. Her voice carried softly, but it filled every corner of the room. "My father believed that freedom meant responsibility," she began. "And Walter believed that legacy is something you live for others." She paused, eyes sweeping the crowd, landing briefly on Luke in the front row. "That belief is why we're here, to turn sacrifice into opportunity." The applause that followed was long, heartfelt, and healing. Local papers picked up the story within days. Small Kansas town honors fallen soldier with scholarship fund. Photographs of Emily and Luke appeared beside headlines about hope and unity. For once, the town's news wasn't about what had been lost, but what had been built. People began to visit the foundation just to feel something steady again. Luke spent his afternoons after school helping with mail and sorting applications. He'd learned to type letters of congratulations, sealing each with a small American flag sticker. He liked to say that Grandpa Tom and M.R. Walter were both angels watching over the office. Emily smiled every time she heard it, pride and ache weaving together. The foundation had become their family's heartbeat. Every donation mattered, envelopes dropped off by hand, checks written in shaky cursive. Sometimes people didn't sign their names. They just wrote, "For those who still remember." Emily kept those anonymous letters in a small wooden box near her desk. On quiet afternoons, she'd open it and whisper a thank you into the air. Faith, she'd learned, often arrived without a return address. The old Veterans Hall soon became too small for the growing dream. A local contractor volunteered to expand the foundation's offices for free. Farmers offered lumber, the church donated chairs, and the high school band played at fundraisers. What began as one man's act of conscience became a community's mission. The town had rediscovered itself, one scholarship, one name, one story at a time. Emily framed Walter's final letter and hung it above her desk. Debt repaid. Keep planting, it read in his careful handwriting. Every time she looked at it, she remembered his tired smile that last day. He had left her more than a fund. He'd left her direction. Purpose, she realized, is love in motion. As the sun set that evening, she stood outside, watching children ride bikes past the office. The flag above the door swayed in the warm wind, steady and sure. Each wave of red and white felt like a heartbeat between heaven and earth. Emily closed her eyes, letting gratitude settle deep inside her chest. Legacy wasn't a word anymore. It was her life's work. From the diner to the foundation, from hunger to hope, the circle had completed itself. The name Carter had returned to where it belonged, in the mouths and hearts of those who believed. The townspeople had given back what loss had stolen, faith in one another, and somewhere beyond sight, Walter and Tom watched quietly, proud and at peace. The flag they once fought under now flew for every dream they'd protected. Years later, the Foundation's building stood as a landmark on Main Street. Its brick walls bore plaques engraved with the names of scholarship recipients. Children who once struggled were now soldiers, doctors, teachers, and parents. Each name was a story, and each story traced back to one folded flag. Emily, now older, walked those halls every morning with reverence. The centerpiece of the building was a glass case near the entrance. Inside rested her father's flag, no longer hidden in a pillowcase or a pawn shop. It sat beneath engraved words. Freedom isn't free. Honor is forever. Visitors paused there first, bowing their heads without needing instruction. Even the youngest children seemed to understand it meant something sacred. Emily often found herself standing before the case after hours. Her reflection mingled with the stars on the flag, 2 generations meeting in silence. She would rest her palm lightly against the glass, the cool surface grounding her. Every thread of that flag carried memory, courage, and forgiveness. "I brought it home, Dad," she would whisper. Just like you asked, the Foundation had grown beyond her small town now. Donations came from across the state, even from veterans she'd never met. The scholarship had funded hundreds of students, each carrying the Carter name forward. Reporters still called sometimes, but Emily preferred the quiet stories, like when a young widow sent a note. "Your father's flag helped me start again." Luke, now a teenager, had inherited his mother's steadiness and his grandfather's spirit. He volunteered at the Foundation's events, tall and confident, carrying the flag at every ceremony. When people asked what it meant to him, he smiled and said, "It's who we are." Emily would watch him from afar, her heart swelling with something beyond pride. It felt like seeing legacy walk, breathe, and wave back. The town itself had changed, too. New murals, clean streets, more flags than ever. The diner had a photograph of Walter and Tom hanging above the counter. The pawn shop where it all began had closed years ago, its sign repainted red, white, and blue. No one forgot what had happened there. They just turned pain into remembrance. Even strangers knew this town had a story worth telling. On the anniversary of the Foundation, Emily hosted a gathering. Veterans, students, and townspeople filled the hall, their laughter soft but proud. She stood at the podium, her hair streaked with silver, her voice calm and sure. "This flag once represented loss," she began. "Now it represents love." Every head bowed as she looked toward the glass case gleaming in the light. She told them about Walter, about his kindness, his sacrifice, his second chance. She told them about her father, about his courage, his promise, his legacy. And she told them about the moment in that pawn shop when everything had almost been lost. A hush swept the crowd as she said, "That was the day Faith walked in." A single tear rolled down her cheek, but it carried peace, not pain. When the event ended, she lingered by the flag one last time. The building had grown quiet, the lights dim, the world outside calm. She touched the glass gently, tracing the stars beneath her fingertips. "We did it, Dad," she whispered through a trembling smile. Outside, the wind caught the flag above the door and made it dance. Children's laughter echoed faintly down Main Street, mingling with the hum of distant church bells. Emily stood still, her heart filled with the weight of generations and grace. The same flag that once nearly vanished now lived forever in this town's story. It no longer belonged to her alone. It belonged to everyone who still believed. And through the Kansas twilight, the stars and stripes waved like a promise kept. Memorial Day dawned warm, a Kansas sky, a clear, faithful blue. Main Street filled with folding chairs and the smell of cut grass. Flags lined the curb like guardians, each one catching the light. Emily Carter stood at the podium, older, steady, unafraid. Beside her, Luke stood tall, the flag-bearer of their name. A brass band tuned softly, then fell into respectful hush. Veterans adjusted caps, kids squinted into the sun. Church bells counted the hour with a clean, honest tone. Emily looked over the crowd and saw neighbors, not strangers. This was the America her father had believed in. She began with the story that had changed the town's heart. A winter pawn shop, a folded flag, a stranger's steady voice. She named Walter Reed and let the silence honor him. "Legacy," she said, "is love that refuses to retire." Heads bowed, and a breeze lifted the banners like an amen. Luke stepped forward with a list of new scholarship names. Voices answered "Here" from families scattered through the crowd. Each name rang clear, a bell struck for a future unafraid. Applause rose, not loud, but deep and decent. You could feel the town growing straighter in its chair. Reporters hovered at the edges, cameras respectful, still. They framed the flag in glass behind the speaking stand. Stars gleamed through the foyer like watchful eyes. No one told the children to be quiet. They simply were. Some places teach reverence without using the word. Emily spoke of duty without politics, of sacrifice without vanity. She talked about bills paid with courage and kindness, about widows who learned to breathe again by helping others, about a farm turned seed and seed turned into harvest, about a promise kept by two men and a town that remembered. Then the band began America the Beautiful, slow and sure. People rose, hats over hearts, hands over promises. A few tears fell, and no one hid them away. In that sunlight, sorrow and gratitude finally shook hands. The flag above the door bounced, then lifted higher. After the music, Emily offered the day's plain benediction. "Where we see prejudice, we answer with service," she said. "Where we meet despair, we practice stubborn hope. Where legacy is questioned, we show up and prove it. Justice here meant every child's to stand and try." She thanked the crowd, then turned to Luke with a smile. He raised the flag rope. Fabric rose like a heartbeat. The town watched as stars and stripes found their place. Wind carried the colors to the far fence line of memory. No one moved until the halyard's clip lay quiet against the pole. When the square began to empty, Emily stayed a while longer. She touched the glass case and whispered, "We kept it living," then faced the camera with a simple, steady invitation. Have you or someone you love ever had to prove people wrong because of prejudice? Tell us in the comments. And the flag kept waving, promise kept, legacy in motion.